The streets of San Francisco. A cold night, a fateful encounter. The city of San Francisco was alive with energy. Neon lights flickered, cars honked in the distance, and people walked hurriedly through the streets, lost in their own worlds. But beneath the towering skyscrapers, beyond the high-rise apartments, and just outside the glass-walled offices of Silicon Valley's elite, another world existed, one that few cared to acknowledge. This was the world of the forgotten. In the shadows of success, among the crowded alleys and subway stations, lived those who had been left behind by the system. People who once had dreams, families, careers, until life had other plans. And on this cold night, one such man sat hunched on a sidewalk bench, shivering under a thin, ragged blanket. His name was Charlie Greene, a man who once had it all. Charlie wasn't always homeless. Once upon a time, he had been an engineer, a man of ambition and ideas. He had worked for a mid-sized tech firm, writing code for early AI programs, before artificial intelligence became the powerhouse industry it was today. But then, like so many others, Charlie's life took a turn. A failed startup, a bad investment that wiped out his savings, the loss of his wife in a tragic accident, the slow descent into depression, then unemployment, then nothing. It didn't happen overnight, but one day he woke up with no job, no home, and no direction. The city that had once felt like a playground of opportunity became a prison of survival. Tonight, like every other night, Charlie sat near the entrance of a high-end cafe, watching the wealthy executives walk by, sipping their overpriced lattes, discussing million-dollar ideas like they were lunch specials. No one saw him. No one cared, until one man stopped. And that man was Sundar Pichai. An unlikely meeting. The CEO and the homeless man. Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google and Alphabet, had spent the entire day in back-to-back meetings. His schedule was relentless. Investor discussions, AI innovation talks, leadership conferences. But despite his position at the top of the tech world, Sundar had never lost his ability to observe the world around him. And tonight, as he left a business dinner with a group of investors and engineers, something made him pause. On the sidewalk, just outside the fancy cafe where he had just met with executives discussing the future of AI, sat a man wrapped in a tattered blanket, clutching a cardboard sign that simply read, "Anything helps." Their eyes met for a brief second. And then, in a voice that was hoarse but filled with an odd kind of humor, Charlie spoke. "Hey man, you got $1?" Sundar blinked. For a second, he was caught off guard. Not because of the request, but because of the way it was asked. Charlie wasn't begging. He wasn't even looking for sympathy. His voice carried a strange kind of dignity, as if he was simply testing the universe to see how it would respond. One of Sundar's colleagues chuckled uncomfortably. Another looked away. The wealthy crowd around them ignored the interaction completely, as if neither Charlie nor Sundar even existed in their world. But Sundar stepped forward. And what happened next would change both of their lives forever. A simple request, a deeper conversation. Sundar didn't reach for his wallet immediately. Instead, he did something no one else had done in a long time. He sat down, right there, on the sidewalk. Charlie raised an eyebrow. "Man, if you're gonna sit next to me, I should at least charge you rent." Sundar chuckled. "Fair enough. But let me ask you something. Why did you ask for $1? Charlie shrugged. "Because can you give me $1 million? Might be too much pressure." Sundar smiled. "Maybe. But let's say I gave you $1. What would you do with it?" Charlie sighed, stretching his tired hands. "Buy a coffee. Maybe save it for a cheap burger later." Sundar studied him for a moment. "And then?" Charlie frowned. "What do you mean, and then?" Sundar adjusted his glasses. "Let's say I gave you $10, or 100. What happens next?" Charlie thought about it. "I guess I'd get a warm meal. Maybe a place to sleep for a night. Sundar nodded. And then Charlie let out a dry chuckle. Man, you're turning a simple question into a whole philosophy lesson. Sundar smiled. Maybe. But let me ask you something else. What did you do before this? Charlie hesitated. Before what? Before you were here, what was your life like? Charlie fell silent. For the first time in a long time, someone was asking him to remember. To not just be a homeless man on the street, but to be who he used to be. I was an engineer, Charlie said finally. Worked in AI. Built algorithms before AI became the buzzword it is today. Sundar's eyes flickered with interest. You worked in AI. Charlie nodded. Yeah, before I lost it all. Sundar leaned back slightly, processing this. A man who had once been at the forefront of technology, now reduced to asking for a single dollar. Not because he lacked intelligence, not because he didn't have something valuable to offer, but because the world had written him off. And for Sundar, that wasn't just a tragedy. It was an opportunity. The offer that would change everything. Sundar pulled out his wallet, but instead of handing Charlie a dollar, he took out a business card. Charlie stared at it. What's this? Sundar smiled. A job interview. Charlie laughed. A real, genuine laugh. You're kidding, right? No, Sundar said. I'm not. Charlie's smile faded as he saw the seriousness in Sundar's eyes. You said you worked in AI. Sundar continued. If that's true, then your mind is worth a lot more than a dollar. Charlie stared at the card in disbelief. You think I can just walk into Google and get a job? Sundar chuckled. Not immediately. But if you're willing to put in the work, I'm willing to help. Charlie swallowed hard. For years, he had believed he was too far gone, that he had nothing left to give. But now one of the most powerful men in the world was looking at him, not as a failure, but as a man with potential. Charlie clenched the business card in his hand, and for the first time in years, hope flickered inside him. The weight of a single business card. Charlie sat on the cold concrete sidewalk, staring at the small Google-branded business card in his hand. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of all his past mistakes, lost years, and broken dreams. The name on it was printed in clean, bold letters. Sundar Pichai, CEO, Google and Alphabet. Charlie exhaled sharply, running a calloused hand through his unkempt hair. For the first time in years, someone saw him as something other than a homeless man. Not a beggar, not a statistic, but a man with potential. Yet, as he clutched the card, a bitter thought crept into his mind. Could he really do this? The world had forgot him. Charlie had been on the streets for 7 years. 7 years since he had last sat in an office. 7 years since he had written a single line of code. 7 years since he had felt like he belonged anywhere. The world of tech had moved on without him. When he first lost his job, he thought he'd find another. He sent hundreds of resumes, knocked on doors, called old contacts. Nothing. Then came the rejections, the lost hope, the eviction, the downward spiral into survival mode. Now he wasn't sure if he even remembered how to be Charlie Greene, the engineer. He only knew how to be Charlie Greene, the man no one looked at twice. Until tonight, until Sundar Pichai sat down next to him and saw something more. The first step. But was he ready? Charlie traced the edges of the card with his fingertips, his mind racing. He wanted to believe it was real. But reality had taught him that second chances were a lie. People liked the idea of helping the homeless, but no one wanted to actually take a risk on them. And yet this wasn't just anyone offering a chance. This was Sundar Pichai, the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the world. Charlie felt a lump in his throat. He had a choice to make. He could take the easy path, crumple the card, toss it aside, pretend none of this had ever happened. Or he could take the first step towards something terrifying, something unknown, something that might just change everything. A night of restless thoughts. That night, Charlie curled up in the doorway of a closed bookstore, trying to block out the noise of the city. But sleep didn't come easy. His mind wouldn't stop replaying the moment. Sundar's calm voice, the look in his eyes. Your mind is worth more than $1. Charlie sighed, staring at the stars above. He had spent so long believing he had nothing left to give. Could Sundar be right? Was there still something inside him worth saving? The moment of truth, walking into Google. The next morning, Charlie stood outside Google's headquarters. His heart pounded against his ribs. He had no money, no clean clothes, no resume, no computer. But he had one thing, the business card in his pocket. He swallowed hard, stepping toward the massive glass doors. Immediately, he felt out of place. The people walking in wore expensive suits, smart watches, sleek backpacks filled with the latest tech gadgets. Charlie glanced down at his own reflection in the glass doors. His clothes were torn, stained. His shoes were falling apart. His beard was unkempt. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had lived on the streets for years. The old shame came rushing back. What am I doing here? He hesitated. He could turn back, pretend this never happened. But then he heard a voice. Charlie. He turned and saw Sundar Pichai standing near the entrance. Unlike everyone else, Sundar wasn't looking at him with pity or judgment. He was smiling. And just like that, Charlie knew. This was real. An unconventional interview. Sundar led Charlie into a quiet meeting room, away from the polished floors and towering digital screens displaying Google's latest projects. There was no resume, no formal interview. Just two men sitting across from each other. Sundar leaned forward. Tell me something, Charlie. Do you still love coding? Charlie hesitated. I don't know. It's been years. Sundar nodded. Fair enough. But let me ask it another way. Do you still think about it? When you look at tech today, do you still see things you'd want to fix? Charlie swallowed. Every day. Sundar smiled. Good. That means the engineer in you isn't dead. It's just waiting. Charlie exhaled. You really think I can come back from this? Sundar's expression turned serious. I know you can. Charlie rubbed his face. But I have nothing. No computer. No experience in years. No proof I can do this. Sundar sat back. Then let's start with something simple. He pulled out his phone and opened a blank coding editor. He slid it across the table. Show me what you remember. Charlie stared at the screen. His hands trembled slightly. He hadn't touched a line of code in years. His mind screamed that he couldn't do it, that it was too late. But then, instinct took over. His fingers moved, and for the first time in 7 years, Charlie Greene started coding again. The test that would decide his future. For the next 20 minutes, Charlie wrote. At first, it was slow, awkward. But then, like a muscle waking up after years of disuse, it started coming back. Lines of code appeared on the screen. Functions, algorithms, solutions. Sundar watched quietly. When Charlie finally set the phone down, he exhaled sharply. I don't know if it's good, he muttered, but it's something. Sundar picked up the phone, scanning the code. After a few seconds, he smiled. It's more than something, Charlie. Charlie blinked. It is. Sundar nodded. You're rusty. But your logic is solid. Your instincts are still sharp. He set the phone down. Now the real question. Are you willing to put in the work to get back to where you were? Charlie hesitated for only a second. Then, for the first time in years, he said something he never thought he'd say again. Yes. Sundar smiled. Good. Then let's get to work. A journey begins. Charlie didn't get a job at Google that day, but he got something better. A mentor. A chance to rebuild. A roadmap back to the world he thought he had lost forever. Sundar arranged for him to enroll in a coding refresher program, helped him get temporary housing, and connected him with a network of engineers willing to guide him back into the industry. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks. But for the first time in years, Charlie had something he thought was gone forever. Hope. The long road back to who he was. Charlie Greene had spent 7 years being invisible. 7 years wandering the streets, forgotten by the same city where he had once built his dreams. 7 years surviving on scraps, avoiding eye contact with people who walked past him, pretending he didn't hear the whispers of lazy, failure, waste of potential. But now, for the first time, he had something to wake up for. A chance, a challenge, a second shot at a life he thought was gone forever. Sundar Pichai had given him a door back into the world, but walking through it, that would be the hardest thing Charlie had ever done. A new routine, fighting the old habits. The first few weeks were brutal. Sundar had arranged for Charlie to be placed in a temporary housing program, a small, clean apartment on the outskirts of the city, funded by a charity that helped reintegrate people into society. For the first time in years, Charlie had a bed, a roof, a hot shower. But he also had something else: doubt. It was one thing to have a place to sleep. It was another to believe he actually deserved it. Every morning, he would wake up and stare at the walls, his body still wired to the instincts of survival. His mind screamed at him, "This isn't real. This won't last. You're still the guy who lost everything." But every morning, he forced himself to push past the fear. He would get up, take a shower, dress in the donated clothes he had received, and head to the coding program Sundar had enrolled him in. It was a fast-track refresher course, designed for engineers who had been out of the industry for a while. Charlie wasn't just out of the industry. He was out of life, and he had to fight for every inch of progress. The classroom of struggles. The first day, Charlie walked into the tech training center and immediately felt like an outsider. The room was filled with young engineers in their 20s and 30s, all dressed in sleek business casual, sipping on lattes, tapping away on their MacBooks, discussing the latest advancements in AI and machine learning. Charlie. He walked in wearing a second-hand dress shirt, clutching a cheap refurbished laptop Sundar had arranged for him. And the moment he stepped inside, he felt it. The looks, the whispered conversations, the quiet judgment. He was the oldest guy in the room, the only one who didn't seem to belong. And worst of all, the first coding challenge broke him. The instructor gave them a simple assignment: fix a bug in a machine learning algorithm. It should have been easy. But as Charlie stared at the lines of code, his mind went blank. His fingers trembled over the keyboard. Everything he once knew felt like a foreign language. Panic gripped his chest, and for the first time in years, he wanted to run. The temptation to quit. That night, Charlie sat in his small apartment, staring at his laptop. His first day had been a disaster. He was too slow, too rusty, too out of touch. And worse, the voice in his head was getting louder. "You're fooling yourself, Charlie. You don't belong here. You're too far gone." The old habits whispered to him. He could just walk away, disappear again, fade back into the streets. At least there, he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. But then, his eyes landed on the Google business card sitting on his desk. Sundar had believed in him. No one else had in years. And for the first time, Charlie wondered, what if I don't run this time? A call that changed everything. The next morning, Charlie forced himself to return to class. He sat in the back, determined to just blend in. But halfway through the lesson, his instructor called on him. "Charlie, can you explain how we could optimize this function?" Charlie froze. The entire room turned toward him. He felt his face burning with humiliation. He didn't know the answer. And then something even worse happened. A guy sitting near the front, wearing an expensive hoodie and designer glasses, smirked and muttered under his breath, "Why is this guy even here?" Charlie's stomach twisted. He was right, wasn't he? What was he even doing here? Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. A single text. Sundar Pichai. The world only wins when people stop underestimating themselves. Keep going. Charlie swallowed hard. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He raised his hand. And slowly, carefully, he began to explain his thought process. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And for the first time since he had walked into that classroom, he saw a few people nodding. Small wins, big steps. The weeks that followed weren't easy. Every day, Charlie struggled. Every day, he doubted himself. But every day, he pushed through. He stayed late after class, relearning everything from scratch. He asked for help, something he had never done before. He fought the voices that told him to quit. And then, one day, something changed. During a group coding exercise, Charlie fixed a broken AI model that the rest of his team had been struggling with for hours. The guy who had mocked him on his first day. He stared at Charlie, impressed. "Dan," he muttered. That was actually smart. And for the first time in years, Charlie felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Confidence. The conversation that changed everything. A month later, Charlie sat across from Sundar Pichai in a small cafe. "You're doing better than you think, Charlie," Sundar said, sipping his tea. Charlie sighed. "I still have so much to catch up on. I don't know if I'll ever be as good as I was before." Sundar smiled. "Charlie, you keep thinking your best days are behind you." Charlie didn't respond. Sundar leaned forward. "What if they're ahead of you?" Charlie swallowed. He had never thought of that. Sundar placed a small envelope on the table. Charlie hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a formal invitation, an opportunity to apply for a junior engineer position at Google's AI research team. Charlie's hands trembled. "Are you serious?" he whispered. Sundar nodded. "It won't be easy. You'll have to prove yourself. But I think you're ready." Charlie stared at the paper. He had spent years believing he was nothing. But now he had a chance to be someone again. He looked up at Sundar, his eyes filled with something new, something that had been missing for a long time. Hope. And this time, he wasn't going to waste it. A door opens, but is he ready to walk through? Charlie Greene sat at the worn-out wooden table in his small temporary apartment, staring at the Google job application in his hands. It felt surreal. A few weeks ago, he was sleeping on the streets, watching life pass him by. He had accepted that he was too far gone, too broken, too lost to ever return to the world he had once belonged to. But now he held a real opportunity, an interview for a junior engineering position at Google's AI research team. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the papers back on the table. This was what he had fought for. But then, why was he so afraid? The answer was simple. Because deep down, he didn't believe he could do it. The ghosts of failure. As night fell, Charlie paced around the small apartment, the same thoughts circling in his mind like vultures. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he walked into that interview and froze? What if Sundar had been wrong to believe in him? The fear clawed at his chest, making it hard to breathe. He had spent years being invisible, avoiding responsibility, running away from his failures. And now he was supposed to sit in front of Google engineers, the best of the best, and convince them that he, a washed-up, broken-down homeless man, was worthy of being one of them. Charlie sat down on his bed, rubbing his temples. He wanted to disappear again. It was easier to run, easier to quit. But then, something unexpected happened. His phone buzzed. A single message from Sundar Pichai. "You've come too far to stop now. See you tomorrow." Charlie stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Sundar was still watching, still believing. And for the first time in a long time, Charlie decided he wouldn't run. Not this time. The interview, facing the storm. The next morning, Charlie stood in front of Google's headquarters, his pulse hammering. He was wearing a simple button-down shirt and slacks, both donated from the Career Support Center. His shoes, though old, were clean and polished. He didn't look like a billionaire tech entrepreneur. He didn't look like a genius programmer. But for the first time in years, he didn't look homeless. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The receptionist greeted him kindly and led him to a glass-walled conference room. Charlie's nerves tightened as he entered. Inside, 3 Google engineers sat across from a long, sleek table, laptops open, pens tapping, eyes expectant. And at the far end of the room, Sundar Pichai sat quietly, observing. Charlie's stomach twisted into a knot. This was it. The technical challenge. Can he still do this? One of the engineers, a woman with sharp eyes and a patient smile, leaned forward. Charlie, welcome. Before we begin, let's start with a simple coding challenge. You have 30 minutes. She slid a laptop in front of him. Charlie felt his hands go cold. He opened the coding interface and stared at the screen. The prompt was clear. Optimize the given algorithm to run more efficiently with large datasets. Charlie blinked, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. This was exactly the kind of challenge he used to solve in minutes. But today, his mind went blank. Not now. Not here. Not in front of Sundar. The voices in his head whispered, "You don't belong here. You're not one of them anymore. They're going to laugh at you." Charlie's fingers hovered over the keyboard, frozen. Then something unexpected happened. He heard Sundar's voice, calm and steady. "Trust your instincts, Charlie." Charlie took a deep breath. He had spent weeks fighting for this chance. He wasn't going to let his fear steal it from him now. Closing his eyes for a second, he exhaled. Then he started typing. The moment of truth. Minutes passed. At first, his hands moved hesitantly. But then, as he got into the flow, something clicked. The knowledge he thought he had lost, it was still there. The instincts, the ability to see patterns in the code, to anticipate where the problem was, to optimize functions with clean, efficient logic, they all started coming back. He rewrote the function, cutting down unnecessary steps. He restructured the algorithm, making it run faster. He commented his thought process clearly, as he used to do in his old job. When the timer buzzed, he leaned back, breathless. The room was silent. One of the engineers took the laptop, scanning the code. A few seconds passed. Then, a nod. Then another. Then a small, impressed chuckle. The woman across the table looked up. "This is really good," she said. "You refactored the algorithm beautifully. The time complexity is significantly reduced." Charlie felt his chest tighten. She continued, "Honestly, this is better than some of the submissions we've seen from experienced engineers." Charlie swallowed. He wasn't sure if he had ever felt more relieved in his life. The engineers exchanged looks, then turned to Sundar. Sundar smiled. "I think we have our answer," he said. Charlie barely processed what was happening. Then Sundar looked directly at him. "Charlie," he said gently, "welcome to Google." Charlie's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. But no, this was real. This was happening. After 7 years of being invisible, of believing he was worthless, Charlie Greene was officially an engineer again. A life reclaimed. The next few weeks were a blur. He moved into a better apartment, his first real home in years. He received his Google employee badge, a moment that brought tears to his eyes. He sat in meetings, not as an outsider, but as an equal. He started earning a real paycheck, enough to rebuild his life. But most importantly, he believed in himself again. One evening, Charlie sat on his balcony, looking over the city that had once abandoned him. His phone buzzed. A message from Sundar. "Proud of you, Charlie. But this is just the beginning. Keep building." Charlie smiled, gripping his phone. He wasn't a failure. He wasn't broken. He was just getting started. The weight of a new life. For the first time in 7 years, Charlie Greene was not invisible anymore. He woke up each morning in his own apartment, not in the cold shadows of an alley. He commuted to work at Google, not wandering aimlessly through the streets. He sat in meetings with engineers and tech innovators, not in silence, hoping people would toss him a few spare coins. His life had transformed into something unimaginable just a few months ago. But deep down, he wasn't at peace. Because even as he moved forward, his past refused to let him go. Every time he sat in the Google cafeteria, surrounded by young, brilliant minds discussing AI advancements, he felt like a fraud. Every time he logged into the company's advanced coding systems, he wondered how long it would take for someone to realize he wasn't good enough. He had fought so hard to be here, but did he really deserve it? Or had Sundar Pichai simply made a mistake by believing in him? A past that won't stay buried. One evening, after a long day of work, Charlie walked through the bustling streets of San Francisco, hands deep in his coat pockets. Despite his success, he still couldn't shake certain habits from his years on the streets. He avoided walking near police officers, a reflex from years of being harassed for loitering. He found himself checking the sidewalks, recognizing the same homeless faces he had once shared meals with. He still flinched when people brushed past him, as if expecting someone to tell them he didn't belong. And then, as he turned a corner, he heard a voice that froze him in place. Well, look who cleaned up real nice." Charlie turned slowly, his stomach twisting. There, standing in the shadows of a rundown liquor store, was a man he had hoped to never see again. Mike Tanner, Charlie's old friend, his street brother, the man who had helped him survive when he had nothing. And now, Mike looked exactly the same as he had the last time Charlie had seen him. Dirty, exhausted, with eyes full of bitterness and regret. Charlie's heart pounded. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was his past coming back for him, a guilt that wouldn't leave. Mike smirked, taking a step forward. "I gotta say, man, you wearing a damn company badge now. What, you work for the fancy tech guys?" Charlie swallowed hard. "Mike, it's not what you think." "Oh, I know exactly what it is." Mike's voice was laced with sarcasm. "You got out, didn't you?" Charlie had no words. Because it was true. He had left. He had escaped the life they had once survived together. Mike shook his head, lighting a cigarette with shaky fingers. Guess all the talk about sticking together was just that. Talk. Charlie clenched his fists. It wasn't like that. Mike exhaled, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Then tell me, brother, what happened to we look out for each other?" Silence. Charlie looked away. Because there was no excuse. He had been given a chance. A miracle. A way out. And Mike. Mike was still in the trenches, struggling, fighting just to survive. For the first time since getting his life back, Charlie felt ashamed. The test of loyalty. Can he save someone else? Mike stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. "You know what? Forget it," he muttered, turning away. "You got your second chance. Just don't pretend you care about the rest of us." Charlie's stomach twisted. Mike had every right to be angry. But wasn't there something he could do? "Wait," Charlie said, his voice firm for the first time. Mike stopped but didn't turn around. Charlie hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the only thing he had that could change Mike's life. A Google business card, the same kind Sundar had once given to him. Mike glanced at it, then scoffed. "What's this? You trying to buy your way out of guilt?" Charlie exhaled. "No, Mike. I'm trying to give you a way out too." Mike didn't move. Charlie continued, his voice full of emotion. "I know what it's like to feel forgotten. To feel like you'll never be anything more than the man people walk past without a second thought. But I also know what it's like when someone finally sees you." Mike's expression softened just a little. Charlie swallowed. "I can't fix everything, but I can help you take the first step, if you want it." A long silence stretched between them. Then finally, Mike took the card. No promises, no big emotional moment. Just a chance. And sometimes, that was enough. A late-night conversation with Sundar. That night, Charlie sat alone in his apartment, staring at his ceiling, thoughts racing. Had he done the right thing? Would Mike take the opportunity, or would he throw the card away, just like Charlie almost had? His phone buzzed. A message from Sundar Pichai. How did it feel to be on the other side of the opportunity? Charlie blinked. How did Sundar even know? He hesitated before replying. Terrifying. A moment later, another message came through. Good. That means you understand why it matters. Charlie let out a deep breath. He had spent so long believing that second chances were just luck. But maybe they were something else. Maybe they were meant to be passed on. And now it was Mike's turn to decide. The next morning, a surprise that changed everything. Charlie walked into work the next day, still distracted by the previous night's events. He barely noticed when a Google recruiter approached him in the hallway. Charlie. He blinked. Yeah. The recruiter smiled. I just wanted to let you know. There's someone here for an entry-level program assessment. Charlie's heart stopped. The recruiter handed him a slip of paper. A name was written on it. Mike Tanner. Charlie's throat tightened. Mike had actually come. His hands trembled slightly as he whispered to himself, maybe I really do belong here. Because second chances, they weren't just given. They were meant to be shared. And Charlie Greene had finally found his purpose again. The weight of a decision. Charlie Greene stood near the Google recruitment office, staring at the slip of paper in his hand. Mike Tanner. He had actually come. Charlie's chest tightened with a mix of relief, anxiety, and something he hadn't expected. Pride. For the first time, Charlie wasn't just the one being given a second chance. He was the one giving it. The thought shook him. For years, he had seen himself as a failure, a man too broken to fix. Even after securing his job at Google, even after finding stability, he still woke up sometimes expecting it all to disappear. But now someone else was following the same path he once walked. And whether Mike succeeded or not, Charlie had done what mattered most. He had opened the door. The interview that could change everything. Charlie stood at the glass window outside the Google assessment room, watching as Mike sat across from a panel of recruiters and engineers. Unlike Charlie's interview, which had been a personal exception given by Sundar Pichai himself, Mike was going through the real process. No shortcuts, no favors. Just a man who had spent years in the shadows, trying to prove he was worth more than the world had made him believe. Charlie could see the tension in Mike's shoulders, the nervous way he shifted in his chair. He knew exactly how Mike felt, like an imposter in a world that had already labeled him as a failure. And when the recruiter slid a laptop toward Mike, Charlie's stomach clenched. This was the real test. The technical challenge. Mike hesitated, staring at the screen. He rubbed his jaw, took a deep breath, and then, slowly, cautiously, he started typing. Charlie watched every keystroke, every pause, every correction. And then something incredible happened. Mike's posture changed. At first, he was tense, but as the minutes passed, he leaned forward, eyes sharpening, hands moving faster. Charlie could see it happening, the same way it had happened to him. The mind that had once been lost to the streets was waking up. And this time, it wasn't too late. The results. Will Mike make it? The interview lasted nearly an hour. Charlie paced outside, checking his phone, trying to calm his nerves. And then, finally, the doors opened. Mike walked out slowly, his expression unreadable. Charlie swallowed. Well? Mike exhaled sharply, running a hand through his messy hair. I don't know, man. They were hard on me. Charlie smirked. That's the job. They're supposed to be. Mike hesitated, glancing at the floor. I think I messed up a few things. Charlie crossed his arms. Did you quit? Mike frowned. What? No. Charlie nodded. Then you did better than you think. Mike let out a breathless chuckle, shaking his head. You really believe that? Charlie placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. I do. And for the first time since they had reunited, Mike actually believed it too. Sundar's final lesson. A week later, Charlie received a call. It was from Sundar Pichai. Charlie, Sundar greeted warmly. I hear your friend did well. Charlie let out a breath. Yeah, he did. Sundar paused. Then let me ask you, what are you going to do next? Charlie frowned. What do you mean? Sundar's voice was steady. You've proven that second chances aren't just given. They're built. You didn't just take an opportunity, Charlie. You became one. Charlie's throat tightened, because for the first time, he understood. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't just about escaping homelessness, getting a job, rebuilding his life. This was about creating something bigger, a pathway for others, a way for people like him and Mike, people the world had written off, to find their way back. Charlie exhaled. I think I know what I have to do. Sundar chuckled. Good. Then let's talk about making it happen. A program that changes lives. Months passed. Charlie continued working at Google, refining his skills, growing as an engineer. But in the background, he was building something new. With Sundar's support, Charlie launched a Google-backed initiative, a program designed to help former homeless individuals, struggling veterans, and people with broken pasts find careers in tech. Coding workshops for those who had lost their way. Technical boot camps designed for second chances. A recruitment pathway for people like Mike. People with talent, but no opportunity. And the first official member of this program, Mike Tanner. Charlie stood beside him as they welcomed their first class of trainees, watching as a new wave of people who had once believed they had no future took their first steps toward one. It wasn't about just giving money. It wasn't about just offering sympathy. It was about creating real, lasting change, the kind that Sundar had created for him. And as Charlie looked around the room, filled with hopeful faces, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for others. And that was the greatest second chance of all. The final message. That evening, Charlie sat on his balcony, overlooking the San Francisco skyline. His phone buzzed. A message from Sundar. You've come full circle. Keep building. Charlie smiled, because now, he wasn't just rebuilding his life. He was rebuilding the future for those who never thought they had one. And in the end, that was worth more than any job, any paycheck, any title. Because second chances aren't just given, they're created. And Charlie Greene, he had become a creator. The end. Final reflection. The power of second chances. This isn't just a story about homelessness, technology, or Sundar Pichai's kindness. It's about something much bigger. It's about what happens when someone believes in you. It's about the responsibility of passing that belief forward. It's about how true success isn't about escaping your past. It's about helping others escape theirs too. Charlie's journey proves that no one is ever truly lost. Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to see what the rest of the world ignores. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything.